Welcome to the Eduleadership Show. I'm your host, Justin Bader, and in this episode, we'll talk about behavior and disproportionality. We'll talk about accountability and statistics, and we'll talk about PBIS, where it came from, and how it's gone wrong. Let's get to it. First up, the National Center for Youth Law recently published a new article by Ramon Flores and Daniel Lawson arguing that school discipline is full of bias and produces great amounts of injustice for students. The report is titled "In Harm's Way: The Persistence of Unjust Discipline Experienced by California's Students." This is an interesting report because it focuses on the experiences of students in the foster system, students experiencing homelessness, and students with disabilities, all of whom, unsurprisingly, experience school discipline at higher rates than the general population of students. But what I think is really challenging about this report is that the authors seem to not acknowledge that discipline is related to behavior. And instead, what they suggest is that the discipline that students receive reflects educator bias. And this is a pretty big accusation to make, and one that is not really backed by any evidence. And there are some challenges around evidence. But I think it's a pretty remarkable claim to say that if students are suspended at a higher rate, it's not because of what the students did, it's because educators are biased against them. Now, often evidence of disproportionality can be found. If you look historically at rates of disparate treatment of different groups, we don't have a great track record as a country, but I find this particular report interesting because it focuses on students in the foster system and students experiencing homelessness. I'm not aware of any historical pattern of educator bias against students in the foster system. So this is a pretty remarkable claim, and one that I think warrants some very close scrutiny. Now, I do think the authors are right to focus on the issue that they focused on, which is that when students are suspended from school, they lose the opportunity to learn. And that is a bad thing. We should be looking to increase learning and increase the amount of time students are spending on learning. And certainly missing school for any reason is bad, but missing school because you're suspended is doubly bad. And I think the reason it's doubly bad that the authors overlook is that not only are you missing school, but you also did something that was serious enough, that was damaging enough, that was disruptive enough, that now you are the kind of person who did that. So not only do you miss school, but you live with the consequences of your own behavior. I think that's the part that authors of this study are attempting to sweep under the rug. They're attempting to say, well, getting in trouble is just a matter of educator bias, and we can fix that by banning educator bias through various means. And they have some specific policy recommendations for how to do that. What they're not examining is the difference between the behavior and the consequence. And they're saying, well, if we can just eliminate the consequence, then this whole thing goes away. And my reaction to that is, well, have you ever been in a school? The behavior does not go away if you stop giving consequences. In fact, the behavior typically gets much, much worse when you stop giving consequences, because kids are kids. They're going to push boundaries. They're going to try things. And a lot of negative behaviors are rewarding for the student. So if there's no consequence, we are going to see behavior get worse. And I don't think it behooves us to ignore the behavior of the students who are getting in trouble and pretend that they're just getting in trouble because of bias. Again, I think the authors are right to be concerned about disproportionality, but I think they're wrong to treat this as an issue that schools can fix. I think disproportionality in discipline statistics, in test scores, in any other measure that occurs in schools is largely a result of material inequality that happens outside of school. Right? What is different about the lives of children who are in foster care? What is different about the lives of children who are experiencing homelessness? Well, it's not that their teachers necessarily are mean to them or that the principal is biased against them. It's that their lives are actually much, much harder. And that manifests in their behavior at school. And that behavior is no less real simply because those students are experiencing difficult lives. That behavior is no less impactful on the learning environment and on peers simply because of the difficulties that those students are facing. So I think we should have compassion. I think we should absolutely care about our students. We should support them in every way that we can, but we should not sweep harmful behavior under the rug and say that it doesn't matter or that the consequences that we're seeing aren't fair and are a result of educator bias. And I think it would also be very helpful to us if we could think in proportional terms about the contributions of student behavior and educator bias. So take a look at this little diagram here. If we make a spectrum from bias to behavior, and in the middle, if we place an X in the middle, we might say, okay, well, they're equal contributors to the disproportionality that we're seeing in our discipline statistics. When it comes to students in the foster care system, I don't think that's a credible claim that it's 50-50. I think overwhelmingly, the discipline that students are receiving reflects their behavior, not educator bias. And we could place the X in different places for different groups, and especially as you go farther back in time. I mean, I don't at all want to deny that bias is a real thing. But I also don't think there's any credible evidence of educator bias against students in foster care or students experiencing homelessness. I think what we're seeing is overwhelmingly that suspension and other discipline statistics that have disproportionality for these groups, that reflects behavior. These students have harder lives, so of course they're going to have disproportionality if we look at them as a group. And it's important to remember that every group is composed of individuals, right? There are lots of students who are in foster care or experiencing homelessness or facing other challenges in their lives who are doing fine in school, who are not defiant, who are not getting into fights, who are not cussing out their teachers. We have to decide when a student does that, are we going to treat all students fairly according to a consistent set of rules that apply equally to everyone? Are we going to give consistent consequences to everyone, or are we going to sweep behavior under the rug if it gives us statistics that we don't like? And I think we have to get back to the purpose of education. What are schools for? The authors of this paper position justice as the highest aim. And I understand they're attorneys, they're activists for youth justice, but I think our role as educators in justice for young people centers around their education. It is just to give all young people a high quality education. It is not just to manipulate our behavior and discipline practices in order to produce pretty statistics. And don't get me wrong, disproportionality is ugly. We don't like it. We don't want it. But the only way we can really fix it is to focus on behavior. And we know that as schools, we have some ability to improve student behavior. We should be doing everything we can to improve student behavior. But what we should not be doing is manipulating our statistics to produce some twisted notion of justice on paper to make attorneys happy. So my bottom line here is that disproportionality alone is not evidence of bias or injustice. It often reflects real-world inequalities that manifest in behavior. And that brings us to some very important questions about accountability. The authors of this paper really want to hold schools accountable for the disproportionality that exists in their discipline statistics. But I'm convinced that that is backfiring quite badly already and will backfire even more if their policy recommendations are implemented. And to understand why, we need to be familiar with two related laws. Either one of these would suffice, but both Campbell's Law and Goodhart's Law state some version of the idea that when we take some sort of metric, some sort of measure that's quantitative, and we say, you are accountable for this, we're now starting to distort the process that statistic measures. We're now starting to distort the measure itself by making it the focus of accountability. And one mechanism, or one example of that in the paper that the authors cite is that when California banned the use of suspension for defiance, then suspensions in other categories went up a commensurate amount. And that's certainly understandable because what is the purpose of school? What is the goal of a school administrator? Well, it's learning. It's to protect the learning environment. And when we have behaviors that are incompatible with a safe and orderly learning environment, administrators need some way to protect that environment and to deal with that behavior. So I'm not convinced that there is a good solution statistically to look at the behavior disproportionality and say, your school is biased, you are doing discipline wrong, because we don't have the data to substantiate that type of claim. And this is surprising to a lot of people, but if you look into any of the research that's been done on school discipline, you will quickly realize that there is not actually any data on behavior. Some schools have climate surveys, and I think climate surveys are worth doing and worth taking seriously, but any study of discipline and consequences and disproportionality that you will find does not have behavior data in it. What it has instead is consequence data. And consequence data is used as a proxy for behavior. And I think to a certain extent that makes sense, right? If you have a lot of suspensions, then you probably have a lot of behaviors that led to those suspensions, right? Because I don't believe that most of those suspensions were bogus. I don't believe they were the result of bias. I believe they were the result of student behavior that is probably mostly real. But in order to determine if a school is biased or if a school is being excessive in the consequences that they're giving out to students, we have to be able to compare behavior and consequences. And we can't because there is no behavior data. And I'm not sure that we should try to create sources of behavior data because I believe they would be subject to those same distortion pressures. What I think everyone can agree on is that every student deserves a fair shake in their specific case. And probably most people would admit that that does not always happen. Not all students get treated fairly in the school discipline process. So there are specific cases that deserve to be investigated. There are specific administrators that deserve to be held accountable for the decisions that they made that negatively impacted students in a way that was unfair based on the behavior. There are lots of stories out there like this. If you get in a fight, you didn't start it and you get suspended, there are some things that are worth looking into. And of course, those get complicated because they are fact specific and there may be lots of them. But I think that's the only basis on which we can say you as an educator were biased against a student. I don't think we can look at the data and say, well, you're biased against homeless students or you're biased against students in the foster care system. We simply cannot substantiate those claims. And I think common sense and logic tell us that overwhelmingly, when kids get in trouble at school, it's for what they did, not because of educator bias. But let me know what you think. Next up, I was quoted in an article in City Journal by Neetu Arnold entitled "The High Costs of Classroom Disorder," in which she traces the history of PBIS as an approach to managing behavior at the school level. And what's really interesting about PBIS is that it's quite vague as a framework. There are some process things that have to be in place. But if you look at a lot of the just nonsensical behavior practices that are in place in schools today, a lot of them involve PBIS in some way. So here is a recent video that I did examining PBIS through the lens of this article. Where did PBIS come from? If you're like a lot of people, you may be wondering where this set of ideas that goes by the name PBIS comes from, because it's really doing a lot of damage in a lot of schools. Well, a new article by Neetu Arnold in City Journal entitled "The High Costs of Classroom Disorder" explores the history of PBIS and explains how it started in special education. And that makes a lot of sense to me, where your goal is to teach desired behaviors, teach appropriate behavior in a school context, and don't treat that as an issue primarily of like punishment or anything negative. You want to teach the acceptable behaviors. And I think there's a really good equity argument for doing that, in the sense that when students don't come in behaving appropriately, our first line of defense should be teaching the acceptable behaviors. I think it's totally appropriate to do as a school, as an educational organization, and it's what we did when I was a principal. We taught the expected behaviors. But in recent years, PBIS has become a whole bunch of other things, and it's become kind of an empty container for a whole bunch of ideas, many of which are bad. And Arnold's article explains how that happened. And now there is, for the last couple of decades, been a taxpayer-funded center run by the U.S. Department of Education that's provided training. There are also private sector trainers who promote things that sound good and maybe on their face are good, like collecting data and meeting regularly to talk about behavior. Like, there are some process things that make a lot of sense, but we have to be careful that we're not endorsing a framework that's too flexible in incorporating bad ideas. And one of the biggest bad ideas popularized under the banner of PBIS, even though it wasn't originally part of it, is the idea that there can never be consequences or boundaries for behavior, that there can only ever be rewards. That's just not how human beings work. If there are no consequences, then the behavior itself can be inherently rewarding and there's no limit on it. And that's why I think we have all these practices like kids getting sent back to class, after they're sent out to the office for some extreme behavior, they come back with a snack. Like, what's going on there? Well, if we have this empty container where all we have to do is collect data and getting good-looking data is our only priority, and we're not actually thinking about how do we create a safe and orderly school environment, well, that's kind of how we ended up where we are today. So I would highly encourage you to check out Neetu Arnold's article, "The High Costs of Classroom Disorder," because she goes in-depth on the history, she goes in-depth on the kind of origins and talks to the trainers and talks to a lot of teachers. She talked to me, and we really got into some detail here about how things have gotten to where they are. One piece that I was not familiar with that I'm really glad she touched on is what's called the tiered fidelity inventory. And that's basically a rubric that the school can use to score itself on how well it's implementing PBIS. And this is crazy to me, but consequences give you 0 points. All right, I'm going to read this here. Responses to contextually inappropriate behavior. Schools get a 0 if their responses rely solely on reactive and punitive consequences. In other words, if the consequence occurs after the behavior, you get a 0. If the consequence is not a reward, you get a 0. Like, how do you win at this as a school and still do things that make any sense at all? A top score of 4, by contrast, gets awarded when schools emphasize functionally relevant instructional and restorative responses. And I get that we don't want students to just feel bad when they get in trouble. We want, something positive to happen so that they can move forward. But at the same time, there have to be consequences. There have to be boundaries. So read the article. I'll put a link in the comments and let me know what you think about PBIS. That's it for this episode of the Eduleadership Show. I'm Justin Bader, and I'll see you next time.